Thank you. If you don't have one of these in front of you, there's a stack in each of these tables, or you can grab one from the closest empty spot. Well, you'll need this while I'm talking. There's an outline in here. I don't have a PowerPoint, so your PowerPoint is the outline, and there's an example sheet. I'll cue you when you need to look at that, and then there's an editing exercise that we'll use later. Thanks for coming. My favorite childhood book is The Mad Scientist Club by Bertrand R. Brinley. I still have the paperback copy that I bought in grade school. I read it so often the cover became mealy, rendering little support to the pages. Eventually the book began falling apart, so I taped it together. I've kept it so long that the paper has ceased to be white and largely has lost even its yellowing patina to a light brown shade. The pages are well on their way to brittleness. For decades, I have kept the book in a Ziploc bag and stored it on a special shelf in my bedroom. I bought the book through the Scholastic Book Club at school. Money was tight, so I wasn't able to order everything I wanted. I agonized over the books I'd circled in the flyer. I don't remember what else I'd hoped to buy, but I do remember thinking that I really needed this book. A collection of stories about boys who turned their town upside down using science and two-way radios, aligned perfectly with my fourth grade dreams. The boys in the Mad Scientist Club did things I would have loved to do: create a sea monster and terrorize the town of Mammoth Falls with it, try to hatch a dinosaur egg that they'd found in a quarry, recover some old stolen money from a Civil War cannon in the town park, disrupt the Founders Day celebration with an unidentified flying man, win a balloon race, haunt a house, and best of all, rescue a downed military pilot whom the Air Force was having trouble finding, all while outsmarting the adults of the town and besting a rival club. I think I was in college when I noticed how well written the book is. It's not that the prose is so artistically beautiful. The author uses basic sentence structures and accessible vocabulary in a straightforward style, but his prose has such good flow, changing sentence lengths and structures to create variety within paragraphs. And his sentences are clean and clear, well put. You never have to reread anything to grasp what it means. If reading Brinley's prose were buttering toast, it would be like running a hot knife through butter. That's how smooth it is. Or rather, it's like skating on a sheet of ice that has just been resurfaced, the Zamboni having scraped off the bumps and ridges, vacuumed the shavings and debris, and filled in the ruts with water, creating a surface so fast and smooth, so nearly friction-free, that you wish you could skate on it all day long. It's a pleasure to read. The beauty of Brinley's prose is not the lyrical beauty of a literary stylist. It's simply the beauty of a well-made thing. Something in us responds to such beauty. We prefer order to chaos, pattern to randomness, the well-put to the rambling, the crafted to the slapped together or even just inexpensively made. I think one of the reasons I love the Mad Scientist Club is that even as a boy, I responded to the beauty of the prose without knowing it. If you walked in and you don't have one of these, get one. There's some at the front here and in empty spots. Why care about good writing? Probably if you've chosen to attend a workshop on editing your own writing, you don't need to be convinced that good writing is important or that you need it to edit your own work. But here are some thoughts on that anyway. It's sometimes theorized that readers today have a high tolerance for poor writing because they're used to reading hurriedly composed, short, unedited email and text messages and social media posts, so publishers could save money by spending less on editing and proofreading. But readers still write publishers to complain about all kinds of errors. They still expect that when they buy a book, what they're buying isn't just the writer's ideas, but also the publisher's attention to detail. Poor writing doesn't serve the author well, failing to engage the reader and undermining the author's credibility. If a book is full of typos, the writer thinks, "This must not be very good, look at all the mistakes." If the writing is awkward, the reader thinks this author must not know what they're talking about. If the writing is unclear, the reader thinks I'm not smart enough to understand this and stops reading. If the writer keeps spinning their wheels, the reader wonders, when's this book going to get started? And if there's a lot of repetition, the reader doesn't trust that the writer knows where they're going. Usually, if a reader thinks a piece of writing is over their heads or is boring, it's not their fault. It's because the writer didn't work hard enough. From a practical point of view, it's important to invest in good writing. From a philosophical point of view, we care about good writing because God is a God of order, not chaos, because God is the author of beauty, not just truth. Orthodox Christians are a people not only of the image, but also of the word. In my freshman year in Bible college, our English professor gave us a rigorous grammar review, making us diagram sentences. Because if we were going to preach and teach the Word of God, we needed to know how language works. Christians, Protestants like to say, are people of the book. We of all people should care about good writing. But the most important reason to care about good writing is because God is a maker, and everything he makes is good. As makers created in his image, we take a craftsman's pride in our work. We don't have to be the best writers, but we do our best to bring into the world well-made things. If you know that show, the Red Green Show on PBS, you know that Red Green always says, if the women don't find you handsome, they should at least find you handy. Why edit your own writing? Even if you know your work will be edited by a publisher or an agent, you need to edit your writing yourself. It's just as important to make a good impression on agents and publishers you hope will represent and publish your work as it is for publishers to make a good impression on readers. If you are a blogger, you want to edit your writing so your readers will have a good experience and follow your posts. But the biggest reason to edit your own writing is because that's how you grow as a writer. Learning to see and fix flaws in your writing develops your skills. The best thing that ever happened to my writing was becoming an editor. Because I don't create the manuscripts I edit, I can see their flaws and how to fix them. It's easier to take the plank out of someone else's eye than to remove the plank from your own. I think Jesus said something similar. As an editor, every day I practice the art of good writing and I become a better writer myself. The editor's stance, distance. Editing your own writing is the same as editing someone else's, except that you aren't coming to the text fresh. When you read it, you already know how it goes, and the more you read it, the more you rehearse it, getting used to what it says and how you think it flows. Your ear comes to tolerate your tics and your mistakes. Because you know what you mean, you can't see where you're failing to communicate. To assess the quality of your work, you have to become a stranger to your own writing. Ways to become a stranger to your work. Put it away. The best strategy for becoming a stranger to your work is to put it away for a while. Set it aside for as long as you can. This taking a break allows your brain to disengage so that when you pick your piece up again, you can see it with fresh eyes. Usually the longer the break, the better. And the shorter your writing is, the more important it is to take a break. Because a blog post or a poem or an article is so short, it takes less time to read it over and over again, and your rehearsal of it becomes more thorough, more quickly preventing you from really seeing it. It's easy after writing a while to feel that your piece is polished and ready to post. Then later, when you've read what you've posted, you find things you'd change. You wish you'd worked on it more. It's best to resist the pressure to post or submit right away. If you're pressed for time, still try to schedule a day or two away from your piece and then return to it. Read it aloud. A great way to see your text afresh is to read it aloud, which slows you down and helps you see flaws. Your brain can function faster than your tongue can move, so it tends to notice more. And reading aloud exposes awkward writing. Usually the way that reads best out loud reads best on the page. Places where you stumble may need revising. Retype it. Another way to alter your perception of your work is to type it over again. This approach is less feasible, perhaps, for long works, but is great for a blog post and even magazine articles. It's a really great way to engage with a poem. If this sounds like it would be really boring, that's because it is. But boredom is an editor's best friend. Because the mind's self-defense against boredom is creativity, boredom can lead you to an engagement with your writing that doesn't happen any other way. Have it read to you. Getting someone to read your work aloud shows you how your writing is perceived by someone else. Note places where they stumble and consider revising them. A suggestion for bloggers, editing partners. Because your work won't be edited by a publisher before readers see it, consider finding another blogger to trade editing services with. Most of the authors I work with who have only ever blogged don't really know how to polish their work. Because they self-publish, they've never had the discipline of being edited, and this stunts their growth as writers. Any feedback they get from their readers tends to be positive and only about how the piece spoke to them, giving bloggers a false sense of the quality of their work. Having someone who is willing to edit your piece with a critical eye before you post it can be invaluable. This suggestion may seem a little strange in a talk about editing your own work, but the truth is that everyone needs an editor. You have to learn to refine your work, but there's only so much you can find on your own. Some notes before you start editing. Be ready to do painful things like cut and rewrite. One of the biggest mistakes writers make is to assume that how they're used to hearing their writing is how it ought to be. I left a lot of things on the cutting room floor that I wish I could tell you today. They're in the footnotes. Beware of confusing style with voice. Sometimes after I've edited a manuscript, the author complains that I've changed their voice. What they really mean is that their writing no longer sounds the way they're used to rehearsing it now that I've cleaned up their style. Style can be changed and edited without affecting your voice. You can write in different styles and still be yourself. Writing tics are not essential to your voice. Be careful not to write exactly the way you talk. Even informal writing should be more polished than speech. And finally, don't be a slave to the rules, but do follow the rules. A 3-step editing process. When I was 8 years old, I was finally big enough to mow the backyard. My dad removed part of the mower's handle to make it short enough for me. I was so excited, though the yard looked enormous to me. Dad taught me that the way to handle a big job is to break it up into smaller parts. So I mowed the perimeter first, big rectangle. Then I mowed down the middle, both ways, a Swedish flag, dividing the yard into quadrants. Then I mowed 2 diagonals to make a British flag. And then I mowed in every direction, cleaning up the odd-shaped patches that were left. It wasn't quite what Dad had in mind. It was less efficient, but it did make the job more interesting, and I got it all done. In writing, the way to handle the big job of editing your own work is to break the task up into different levels of attention. The goal of editing is to make writing clear, concise and felicitous, and correct and consistent. In addition to approaching your writing with editorial distance, the key to good editing is to work toward these 3 ends separately. In my job as a production editor for a book publishing company, I like to think of there being 3 levels of editing: substantive editing, line editing, and copy editing. I think of substantive editing as looking at each sentence and asking, is the meaning clear? Line editing, in my practice, is looking at each sentence and asking, is it concise and felicitous? And copy editing is looking at at the whole piece and asking, is it correct and consistent? You could say that substantive editing is focused on what is said, line editing is focused on how it is said, and copy editing is focused on mechanical distractions. But it's difficult to pay attention to meaning if you are distracted by misspellings, punctuation problems, inconsistencies, and other details. Likewise, if you're thinking only about sense, it is easy to overlook how well that meaning is expressed. And if you're constantly switching between levels from sentence to sentence, it's easy to miss a lot on all levels. So in my practice, I edit one chapter at a time, reading each chapter 3 times before moving to the next. The first time I edit a chapter, I focus on the substantive level. The second time is for line editing, and the third is for copy editing. It's not as if, while focusing on one level, I never make changes at the other levels. Lots of times, fixing an unclear sentence also involves line editing. And often it's easy to fix a few typos and inconsistencies while attending sense or expression. But by giving each level priority in a separate pass, I can give thorough attention to them all. Using the same approach to polish your work can benefit your writing. We don't have time to cover all that you could do when editing your work, but let's take a closer look at these 3 levels of attention, and I'll comment on problems I often see in the manuscripts I edit. If you don't have a gray folder, there are a bunch up here still. Yeah, would you please? Yeah. Thank you. And pencils too. Substantive editing issues. Focus on meaning or clarity. Your substantive editing pass will overlap some with your line editing pass, since clarifying meaning tends also to make writing concise. But this pass is for making sure your sentences are clear. Main issue in substantive editing: grammar. Many problems with clarity result from grammatical errors. The rules of grammar are descriptions of how language works, and following them serves to make meaning clear. It's not a bad idea to review a grammar book from time to time to keep yourself sharp. As Mary Stoughton puts it in her book Substance and Style, you need to hone your skills to be able to find and fix those amorphous problems that weaken prose. I have my college grammar on my desk at work. I crack it open only these days when the younger editors ask me questions and I have to figure out the answer so they think I'm smart. Clarity. Some questions to ask about your sentences. When you write a sentence, you know what you mean, but will your readers? As you review each sentence, ask yourself these questions. And you can refer to the example sheet, starting with example number 1. This is my retro PowerPoint, the papers that you have. It's the only technology I trust for unusual circumstances. Example 1. So, does it mean anything? Sometimes a sentence is so vague it conveys little or no meaning. For example, healthy self-awareness is evolving with acknowledgement and permission. Is this sentence defining self-awareness as when a person evolves? Or is it that self-awareness evolves when there is acknowledgement and permission? Acknowledgement of what and by whom? And permission for or to whom or what? This sentence needs to be rewritten for clarity. Does it mean what I think it means? Sometimes a sentence has meaning, but it's not what you think. To be constantly assigning value and categorizing worth for the sake of male attention felt foolish and life-giving all at the same time. It sounds as if the writer is talking about judging other people. The phrases assigning value and categorizing worth don't seem like ones you'd apply to yourself. but in context, it's apparent the writer is talking about obsessing over her appearance. The uncertainty is a speed bump for the reader, who at best is distracted by the vagueness and at worst has to stop to sort it out. Make it, to be constantly obsessing over my appearance for the sake of male attention felt foolish and life-giving all at the same time. Does it actually say what it means? Sometimes the reader can surmise what you mean, but the sentence is poorly constructed and doesn't actually say what it means. That's the seduction of Satan's lie, the subtle distortion and progression to justifying our sin for the sake of others. The sentence is vague and doesn't precisely describe how seduction works. I would make it, that's how Satan seduces us. He subtly and progressively distorts our thinking until we believe that our sinning is for the sake of others. Does it mean only what I want it to mean? Sometimes a sentence can be taken a couple of ways. In Michigan, and actually I guess Pennsylvania and Ohio, as I noticed as I was driving in, it's common to see road signs that read, "Bridge ices before road." This is when you come to an overpass. As a kid, I always thought this meant the part of the bridge that's just before the road, but not the whole bridge. That might be frozen. But it's a reference to time. The bridge will freeze sooner than the road will, and therefore might be icy. I was glad as a high school student to note other signs that read, "Bridge may be icy," which sounds absurd in summertime, but is crystal clear in winter. When sentences can be taken two ways, usually it's important to limit the meaning by rephrasing. But sometimes you want a sentence to mean two things, such as in poetry or in lyrical writing meant to be suggestive. Here's a phrase from a prose work. "The family now compromised by cancer and a swallowing despair." The author, recovering from throat cancer, not only had problems swallowing after her surgery, which led her to despair, but also struggled with despair that threatened to swallow her. It's beautifully put. Does it say something I've already said? In oral communication, repetition is a useful tool to keep listeners situated in your ideas and to help them remember them. But in writing, it gives the reader the sense that you are talking down to them, or that you don't really know what you're talking about, or that you aren't getting anywhere. If a reminder is important, try phrasing it so it doesn't sound like you're only just introducing the idea, and be careful not to condescend to the reader. Instead of saying, "Do you remember when I said," or, "As I said earlier," say, "Because such and such is true." It's best to avoid repetition. Top 3 impediments to clarity. The top 3 impediments to clarity that I see in manuscripts that I edit are poor word choices, unclear pronoun antecedents, and problem modifiers. Number 1, poor word choices. A freelance editor I sometimes work with is a stickler for using exactly the best word. She'll change a perfectly good word to a synonym because it's more precise. And she's right. But it's not always necessary to be that exacting. If a word conveys the sense intended, that's fine. There may be other reasons to use it, such as it's contributing to the rhythm and sound of a sentence, it's opening up layers of meaning, its fitness with your diction, or it's allowing you to avoid using another word too many times in close context. But do be sure your word choices are the right ones. Example 2 on the example sheet. Just as Joshua succeeded Moses, so the New Testament gospel followed the Old Testament law. Though the writer probably intends followed to mean succeeded, it could be taken to mean obeyed or came after. The reader also wonders whether abolished or fulfilled may have been intended. Best to pick a precise word here. The property was founded in 1902. Properties aren't founded. The writer perhaps was thinking of the orphanage on the property. Either property could be changed to orphanage, or founded could be changed to acquired. I consistently fight a slagging will to live. Slag can mean the dross or scoria of a metal, a coward, a worthless person, or to criticize harshly, none of which fits this sentence. The writer might be thinking of flagging or sagging or slackening. 2, unclear pronoun antecedents. Example 3 on the example sheet. An antecedent is the word a pronoun refers to. Difficulties arise when a pronoun can refer to more than one antecedent. For example, Susan is a marvelous dancer, and so is her sister. She has the lead in the senior play. The first sentence is clear, but whom does she refer to in the second? Logically, the antecedent is probably Susan, but grammatically, she refers to sister. To clarify, she should be changed to Susan. There was a large walnut orchard behind our house. At dusk, the trees would be silhouetted against the sky. One summer day, however, it was bulldozed to make room for a car dealership. In the third sentence, a problem arises with the antecedent of it. Logically, it is clear that the orchard was bulldozed, not the day or the sky. But grammatically, either of these two words could be the antecedent. To make the sentence correct, as well as clear, it should be replaced by orchard. And 3, problem modifiers. A modifier is a word, phrase, or clause that adds descriptive detail to another word, phrase, or clause. One mistake writers often make is to fail to distinguish between restrictive and non-restrictive modifiers. Other common problems include dangling, squinting, and misplaced modifiers. Example 4 on the example sheet. Restrictive versus non-restrictive modifiers. Certain modifiers can be either restrictive, essential, or non-restrictive, non-essential. A restrictive modifier limits the meaning of a term. Without the modifier, the sentence could be ambiguous or have different meaning. Restrictive modifiers are not set off by commas. Here's an example. The restaurant that we went to was very crowded. The clause restricts restaurant to the one in which we ate. Non-restrictive modifiers are parenthetical. They add information but are not crucial to the sentence. Such modifiers are set off by commas. The proposal, which was 100 pages long, was delivered on time. The length of the proposal has no bearing on whether the proposal was delivered on time. The same sentence can be made restrictive. The proposal that was 100 pages long was delivered on time, but the 125-page proposal was delivered late. Dangling modifiers. A word or phrase placed next to a word that it cannot sensibly describe is called a dangling modifier, and it often has a humorous effect. Running for the bus, his hat fell off. The hat's running for the bus. Hissing furiously, the boy removed the kitten from the tree. Can only imagine what noise the cat might have been making. Squinting modifiers. A dangling modifier in the middle of a sentence is sometimes called a squinting modifier. It can modify the phrase either before or after it. While she hesitated with gun poised, he attacked. Who has the gun? Only they know. Misplaced modifiers. Other modifiers are misplaced. They stand near a word other than the one the writer or speaker intended them to describe. Adverbs such as almost, merely, even, nearly, hardly, only, and just are especially easy to misplace. Consider the following sentence. He said that he loved me. Add the adverb only and see how the meaning changes. Only he said that he loved me. He only said that he loved me. He said only that he loved me. He said that only he loved me. He said that he only loved me. He said that he loved only me. Oh. He said that he loved me only. Each of these sentences conveys a different nuance, a variation on the theme. Be careful where you put your adverbs. You don't want to give anyone the wrong idea about your love for them. Editing exercise, first pass. Before we move on to line editing, let's do a quick exercise to simulate your first editing pass through your chapter or short piece. In the handout titled Editing Exercise, I've provided 4 pages from a book manuscript that needs a lot of work. When you're editing your own writing, you'll be pretending that it's someone else's to help you create editorial distance. But in this case, we'll pretend the writing is yours. Read these pages only for sense, ignoring wordiness, awkwardness, spelling errors, punctuation problems, and other details. Keep an eye out for problems with clarity, such as vagueness, poor word choices, unclear pronoun antecedents, and misplaced modifiers. We don't have much time, and it's important that you read all 4 pages, so don't actually do any editing. Instead, just mark the spot where you think there's a problem and keep reading. Don't get bogged down thinking about what is making a sentence unclear or how you would fix it. Okay, I'll give you 10 minutes, and then I'll highlight a handful of problems before we move on. Use the one titled Editing Exercise, not the one that's titled Editing Exercise Key. I feel I should apologize for the subject matter and the theology in this excerpt. I work for an evangelical publisher, and this writer is very Calvinist, and it's just the worst thing I had available for an example. If you get your editing exercise key out, I'm just going to hit some highlights. Don't be too concerned if you didn't find much or if you haven't gotten through it. My intention is that you'll go home with this and give it a thorough go at home when you have time, and you can refer to the key for commentary. Let's see. Right, so looking for possible solutions to problems and clarity. I'll be referring to the comment numbers in the balloons in the right margin of your handout to direct you to each problem I want to highlight. Starting with BP 5. If you find that comment and run your finger along the line to the highlighting in the text, this is an example of vagueness. The phrase, "or cheering circle of wine," is vague, and I just deleted it. BP 11, down near the bottom. Unclear antecedent. The pronoun them is distant enough from its antecedent words that it's probably better to change them to words, the words. BP 26, which is on page 3. The second highlighting in the sentence, this is imprecise. The phrase person or experience of our past is imprecise. We wouldn't say person of our past. In place of the preposition of, the preposition in works for both person and experience. BP 30 is a dangling modifier. The phrase down deep is dangling, incorrectly modifying I think, when what it is intended to modify is we all believe. 32, down a couple. Unclear antecedent. The antecedent of them in the phrase give them their rightful role should be memories later in the sentence. But as written, the antecedent is sacred parts. The writer needs to use a precise phrase such as recognized our most painful memories role instead. Page 4, BP 35. Dangling modifier. In the sentence that begins in the first line at the top of the page, the opening phrase, without a healthy remembrance of the details of our past, should modify we in the third line. As written, it incorrectly modifies memories in the second line. And BP 36 is unclear. The dangling modifier that we just looked at in BP 35 renders imprecise the phrase, leaving us to repeat the pain we've experienced. To fix both 35 and 36, the author needs to change this phrase to we will. How we doing? I had a nice 10-minute break there. I'm fresh. Line editing issues. Focus on expression or concision and felicity. I read this to my daughter, and she wanted to know who Felicity is. Your line editing pass will overlap some with substantive editing, since your editing sentences' expression tends also to clarify their meaning. But this pass is for making sure your sentences are concise and felicitous. The main issue in line editing is wordiness. Some editors take the advice to eliminate all unnecessary words as a challenge to reconstruct a sentence so that it uses absolutely the fewest words possible. If you can say something in 9 words instead of 15, it's good advice to go with fewer words, but it's not necessary to try to get it down to 5. And in some cases, clarifying meaning actually requires more words. Concision, eliminating wordiness. See example 5 on the example sheet. So instead of striving to use the fewest words possible, make every word count by omitting words or phrases that don't add to the meaning. Wordy. Each writer has a distinctive style, and he or she uses this in his or her own works. Make it, each writer has a distinctive style. Don't use many words when a few will express the idea well. Wordy. In the event that the grading system is changed, expect complaints on the part of the students. Make it, if the grading system is changed, expect complaints from the students. One exact word can say as much as many. Wordy, spoke in such a low and hard to hear voice. Make it mumbled. Eliminate needless words by combining sentences or simplifying phrases and clauses. Wordy, a few of the listeners who had become angry called in so they could have the opportunity of refuting the argument set forth by Ian. Make it, a few angry listeners called in to refute Ian's arguments. Be careful, however, not to omit necessary words. Informal writing has become the norm as writers seek to engage readers by writing like they speak. But in speech, we omit words that aid in comprehension. A pitfall of conversational style can be sloppy writing that causes misreading. Confusing. Fran noticed the passenger who was sleeping soundly had dropped his wallet in the aisle. The reader may be briefly confused by the phrase, noticed the passenger. Make it, Fran noticed that the passenger who was sleeping soundly had dropped his wallet in the aisle. Awkward. Preston has never and cannot be wholly honest with himself. Make it, Preston has never been and cannot be wholly honest with himself. Top 3 impediments to concision. In addition to wordiness, the top 3 impediments to concision that I encounter in my editing are unnecessary modifiers, ineffective use of the passive voice, and noun strings and smothered verbs. 1. Unnecessary modifiers. Watch out for redundancies, which are needless repetitions of an idea, and eliminate them. Serious crisis. A crisis is serious. Untimely death. Death is almost always untimely, except maybe in the case of Hitler, as the book that I was referring to pointed out. Basic fundamentals. All fundamentals are basic. My dad was a journalist, and he particularly hated totally destroyed. Because destroyed is total. Often verbs are stronger without adverbs, and nouns are stronger without adjectives. Take care to use modifiers sparingly. 2, ineffective use of the passive voice. Example 6. Verbs convey action in 2 ways, active or passive voice. If the subject of a sentence performs the action, John caught the ball, the verb is in the active voice. If the subject receives the action, the ball was caught by John, the verb is passive. The active voice tends to be more forceful and less wordy than the passive. For example, implementation of the guidelines will be carried out by the new staff members. In the active voice, the shorter version is, the new staff members will implement the guidelines. But don't automatically change the passive voice. If it's important to emphasize the thing done rather than the doer, use the passive. Medea killed her children. The children were killed by Medea. The first sentence emphasizes Medea. The second emphasizes her children, the victims. Also, the rhythm of the language or the flow of a paragraph may lend itself to the passive. Though the night was made for loving, and the day returns too soon. 3, noun strings and smothered verbs. Noun strings, example 7. A noun string is a combination of nouns grouped as if they were adjectives. Noun strings can sometimes defy understanding. Computer spreadsheet program advance information. This string can be clarified by reordering the words, advance information on spreadsheet programs for the computer. A similar problem is that writers sometimes modify a noun with a string of adjectives. I sat on the seafoam green waiting room sectional. Make it, I sat on the seafoam green sectional in the waiting room. Also, sometimes writers, trying to be breezy or humorous or hip, use a trying to be breezy or humorous or hip phrase. I wish they would just make it a phrase that is trying to be breezy or humorous or hip. Smothered verbs. Smothered verbs are action words buried in a group of words. Have a need for instead of need. Adverbs also get buried in large measure or to a great extent instead of largely. Verbs carry the force of the language. Cutting excess words produces a tighter, more forceful sentence. Felicity, writing style. Related to concision is felicity. Usually making your sentences concise makes them felicitous, but you can make your writing beautiful too. Though stylistic writing isn't our main goal in writing clean and clear prose, ideas take on greater power when expressed with style. We respond not just to truth, but also to beauty. When I read, I don't just want the true. I want the beautiful in the true. Top 3 impediments to felicity. The top 3 impediments to felicity that I see in my writing, editing, because my writing is felicitous, are poor flow, inattention to rhythm and sound, and mixed and mangled metaphors. 1, poor flow. The first impediment to felicity is poor flow. 3 common contributors to poor flow are lack of sentence variety, lack of parallelism, and poor word order. Lack of sentence variety. Flow in a piece of writing is achieved when a writer varies the structure and length of sentences to make the whole composition pleasing and effective. To illustrate good flow, we can compare 2 paragraphs. Both use good sentences, both use virtually the same diction. It is varied structure and sentence length that make the difference. Not varied. Yellowstone National Park is traffic congestion to millions of people. It is also crowds in a few hours or days in July. A different kind of Yellowstone, however, begins to appear later. This happens by early September. The nights are growing colder then, and workmen are boarding up lodges and curio shops. This paragraph has 5 sentences, 4 simple and 1 compound, each beginning with the subject and followed by the verb. The flow of this paragraph really isn't all that bad, but listen to this. To millions of people, Yellowstone National Park is traffic congestion, crowds, a few hours or days in July. But by early September, when the nights are growing colder and workmen are boarding up lodges and curio shops, a different kind of Yellowstone begins to appear. This paragraph is 2 sentences, 1 simple and 1 complex, neither beginning with the subject. This paragraph is more pleasing than the first. Lack of parallelism, example 8 on the sheet. Parallelism means that parts of a sentence similar in meaning are similar in construction. To achieve parallelism, writers balance a word with another word, a phrase with another phrase, an infinitive with another infinitive, and so on. Most writers know to do this. For example, not to write, the duties of the proposal manager were the coordination of the effort and to write the executive summary. But instead to write, the duties of the proposal manager were to coordinate the effort and to write the executive summary. Changing the noun, the coordination, to the infinitive to coordinate makes it parallel with the infinitive to write. But I often see a couple of other mistakes. An article or a preposition that applies to a series must either be used before the first item or else be repeated before each item. So, not parallel. The objectives were to cut off the enemy's supply routes, demoralize the population, and to support the existing government. Add the word to before the second phrase, or delete it from the third to make this sentence parallel. The objectives were to cut off the enemy's supply routes, to demoralize the population, and to support the existing government. Correlative expressions, such as both and, not only, but also, and either or, must be followed by the same construction. Not parallel. Not only must you fill out your form correctly, but also pay your taxes. Make it, not only must you fill out your form correctly, but also you must pay your taxes. Or, you must not only fill out your form correctly, but also pay your taxes. Poor word order, example 9. Probably poor word order belongs in substantive editing because it affects clarity, but good word order also lends coherence to a sentence, making it flow better. For example, place modifying prepositional phrases where they clearly indicate what they modify. Newspapers carried the story of the quarterbacks fumbling in every part of the country. Probably the reader won't think that the quarterback fumbled in every part of the country, but potentially it creates an absurd image. Make it, newspapers in every part of the country carried the story of the quarterbacks fumbling. The fact that the story was carried in every part of the country is emphasized by placing the phrase next to newspapers, and the sentence flows better. Okay, this is my favorite part. Inattention to rhythm and sound. The second impediment to felicity is inattention to rhythm and sound. Good stylistic writing uses prosodic effects such as assonance, consonance, and rhythm, avoids ugly sounds, and it doesn't repeat words that clang in close context. Assonance, consonance, and rhythm. Example 10. Assonance is the pleasing repetition of vowel sounds. So I buried myself in the basement, my grave. The pain was too great. I was buried alive, trapped in a body that no longer worked. The repetition of A sounds in this sentence is pleasant. Consonance is the pleasing repetition of consonants. The last of the light glinted off the glass. The L sounds are pleasant in this sentence. So are the G sounds. Rhythm. You and I were made for garden living. Scanning this sentence as poetry reveals that it's trochaic pentameter, 5 beats of pairs of stressed and unstressed syllables. The rhythm makes this observation eloquent. Here's another rhythm example. While we're busy trying to escape mortality, God puts it on. The contrast of the long phrase followed by the short phrase gives the point greater impact. Ugly sounds. Some words just don't sound good. I've never liked the word seeming. The E and ing sounds are too similar, and the M sound doesn't differentiate them well. The word just has a mealy quality. Seeming, I avoid using it. I was frustrated, though, to have to use the word meaning a lot in this talk. Some echoes just don't sound good either. The hook snagged in a crag worn in the stone by the river. The sound is unpleasant enough as it is, and repeating it compounds the ugliness. There was nothing right or normal about the dark, damp camper parked in the middle of a 5-acre field. The phrase dark, damp camper parked makes a really good tongue twister, but not a good bit of prose. Write like a poet, keeping an ear on the sounds your words make, and choosing words for their sounds as well as their sense. Word repetition, example 11. The repetition of a word in close context can sometimes clang. I had rehearsed my confession hundreds of times, but when it came time, no part of me was prepared. Change the second time. I had rehearsed my confession hundreds of times, but when the moment came, no part of me was prepared. Settling onto her couch felt like coming home, and although the critical voice in my head shamed me for landing in a counselor's office again, I did my best to ignore it and settle into the comfort of having a safe place to land. You can avoid the repetitions of the words settling and landing by changing settle and land near the end of the second sentence. I would make it, I did my best to ignore it and embrace the comfort of being in a safe place. 3, mixed and mangled metaphors. The third impediment to felicity is mixed and mangled metaphors. Mixed metaphors impair felicitous writing by calling attention to their inappropriateness. Don't mix metaphors by changing rapidly from one to another. Mixed. Playing with fire can get a person into deep water. That would probably be a good thing, put the fire out. Make it playing with fire can result in burned fingers. In extended passages, sticking to one metaphor is stronger than switching between several. Also, make sure metaphors are working. What proved the most dangerous to my faith in these years of despair wasn't cancer or crisis. It was the theological inaccuracies that infiltrated my faith in childhood. These hidden cancers silently mutated new cells of faith when I was too innocent to know the difference. They spread like a contagion from other flawed, faith-hungry humans like me. This metaphor isn't working because cancer is not spread from human to human. The writer could make it, what proved the most dangerous to my faith in these years of despair wasn't cancer or crisis. It was the theological inaccuracies that had infiltrated my faith in childhood, perpetuated by other flawed, faith-hungry humans like me. Or in other words, take the metaphor out. I guess I could have made that shorter. Wasn't very concise. Okay. I've jam-packed this at an hour and a half, so I'm sorry we can't stop for 5 minutes, but we're ready for another editing exercise, and if you want to blank out in the middle of it, that's okay, because you can take it home. So let's return to our editing exercise to simulate your second pass through your manuscript. This time, read the excerpt only for expression, looking only for problems with concision and felicity, such as wordiness, unnecessary modifiers, ineffective use of the passive voice, noun strings, smothered verbs, errors in parallelism, poor word order, and mixed metaphors. Again, don't actually do any editing, just make a mark at the spot where you find a problem. And after about 5 minutes, I'll highlight some things before we move on. I bet you probably marked a lot of the wordy sentences in the first pass because they seem confusing. Well, returning to the exercise key, I'll highlight some things in concision and felicity. So first, concision, BP2, wordy. The phrase settle into forgotten moments simply categorized is wordy. It could be simplified to settled for being categorized. BP8. This is wordy. The phrase constantly pets us with the distractions of our own comfort is wordy. It could be simplified as constantly distracts us with comfort. BP10. This is redundant. The phrase teaching podium is redundant. make it just podium. Because what else are you doing at a podium, usually? BP 18. The phrase, take notice of the one who, sorry, didn't let you turn the page. BP 18. The phrase, take notice of the one who, is wordy. It could be simply, notice who. 23, next page. This is redundant. The phrase, break apart, is redundant. Make it just break. He probably could leave it, but as I edited this, I took it out. 25, unnecessary modifier. The word identity in the phrase present identity is modified unnecessarily. Delete present. BP 27, redundant. The past experience is redundant. Delete past, because when else did your experiences take place? I suppose you could be pedantic and argue that your present experience is right this second, every second, but I would cut it. I did. 28, redundant. The phrase, our own unique personality, is redundant. The phrase, our personality, covers the same thing. And I'm not really sure how unique our personalities are, but that's another matter. 34 on page 4. Well, actually, it starts on the bottom of page 3, the highlighting, the phrase, often, this is really awkward and wordy, often through an equally painful, if not more so, experience than when we first encountered them, is awkward and wordy. Make it often through an equally painful experience. And 36 right at the bottom, the phrase, our most painful memories will struggle to become fully integrated to our present decisions, leaving us to repeat the pain, is wordy. And as we saw earlier, it contains a dangling modifier. You could just replace it with we will. And that also clarifies the meaning. All right, felicity. BP 9, back on page 1. This example has to my ear, has nice rhythm and sounds. The phrase, pounding these words from a teaching podium, has a nice rhythm, which I think is enhanced by deleting the redundant teaching. Also, the repetition of the P sound is pleasant. BP 12, rhythm. I think splitting this sentence, it is a well-intentioned statement, of course, just not the most helpful one, into a sentence and a fragment gives this paragraph a punchier rhythm. It's a well-intentioned statement, of course, just not the most helpful one. So remember what I said about don't be a slave to the rules, but follow the rules? Break the rules here. It's okay to have a fragment. 14. This is an example of rhythm. The phrase, you're new, clean, and stand before him righteous, isn't parallel. Stand would have to be standing. But if you insert the conjunction and between new and clean and remove the commas, not only is the parallelism problem resolved, but also a pleasing rhythm emerges. You're new and clean and stand before him righteous. 21. Rhythm and sounds. The phrase, mostly used to an open, congested airways, has a pretty good rhythm. But to my ear, didn't sound like it though, the way I read it. But to my ear, if the writer moved the word mostly from before used to after it, a more effective rhythm would be created. In musical terms, mostly to open, congested, creates two consecutive pairs of triplets that creates a satisfying momentum toward the end of the sentence, capping off the whole paragraph nicely. Also, I think the O sound in mostly and open echoes better when those words are closer together. Used mostly to open congested airways. 29. Parallelism problem. The clause, through the nature of others, our own unique personalities, and through the sequence of events we call life, lacks parallelism. Either the word through should be used at the beginning of each phrase in the clause, or only at the beginning of the first phrase. I chose the latter and deleted through before the sequence. And finally, B33 is a mixed metaphor. The use of simmer, which has to do with cooking, and fester, which has to do with wounds, in the phrase, our most painful memories will simmer, fester, and one day demand, creates a mixed metaphor. Fester esteemed the stronger word, so I deleted simmer. All right. So this is the shortest section, copy editing. Just so you know, we're almost there. I'm getting tired too. My tongue is not happy with me right now. Copy editing issues focus on mechanics or correctness and consistency. Your copy editing pass may often be the easiest, since editing sense and expression in earlier passes tends to resolve most mechanical problems. This pass is for fixing remaining problems in punctuation and grammar, correcting spelling, addressing matters of editorial style, and imposing consistency. Main issue in copy editing, distractions. The main goal of copy editing is to remove errors and inconsistencies that distract the reader and undermine your credibility. If your writing is riddled with errors and inconsistencies, reading it will be like trying to watch your child's orchestra concert while numerous audience members keep leaving their seats in what seems like a steady stream, blocking your view, and exit the auditorium, letting the light from the lobby in and doing nothing to keep the door from clanging shut behind them, returning a little later to create the same disruption. It makes it hard to pay attention, let alone to enjoy the music. I'm exaggerating, but good copy editing is a way of being courteous to your reader. Correctness, issues to address. To ensure the correctness of your manuscript, address the following. Correct lingering errors in grammar and punctuation. Check the spelling of words you aren't sure of. And even if you use spell checker, be sure you read every word. I like to think of spell checker as like anti-lock brakes. The anti-lock brake system can tell sometimes a little bit sooner than you need to know that you're slipping. But it also gets you used to not worrying about the conditions and forgetting how to pump your brakes when you're in a skid. And it keeps you from doing donuts in the parking lot, which I think is a bummer. So it's better to turn the spell checker off, I would say. No, that's not true. There are a handful of words that I just don't know how to spell every time. Guarantee is one. No, I don't. I always have to look it up. So I suppose spell checker can alert you to words that are misspelled. That's helpful when you have a list like that. But you do need to know how all the other ones should be spelled. Check your facts. Verify dates, spelling of names and places, titles, accuracy of quotations and citations, and so on. Keep an eye out for sentences that in earlier passes you didn't make clear or concise, and fix them. This happens to me all the time. I kept putting it off. Now it's time to fix it. 3 of my pet peeves in the area of correctness are punctuation abuse, British spelling, and hyphenation. And these are just pet peeves, you can ignore them. Punctuation abuse, don't use an em dash when a comma will do. Don't use a semicolon when a period is just as effective. Don't use ellipses for pauses or dramatic effect in nonfiction. Use exclamation points sparingly, rarely, maybe even never. Use just one question mark and one exclamation point to express incredulity. Most of the time you need only commas, periods, and question marks. Use the rest judiciously. British spelling. British variants of words such as towards, afterwards, amidst tend to make you sound stuffy. It's better to Americanize them. And hyphenation. Some writers overuse hyphens, which distract by creating a dense look to the text. Some writers don't use them at all, which distracts by making the reader reread to sort out word relationships. Use hyphens judiciously to make reading smoother and to clarify sense. Consistency, issues to address. When imposing consistency on your manuscript, address changes in the following. Diction and tone. If your style is casual, be careful not to switch to a formal style. It's an easy mistake to make if you are interspersing narrative anecdotes with teaching passages. Tense. Switching tense can be okay, for example, if you're using past tense for a narrative passage and then switching to present tense to recount the action in a biblical or other literary story. But generally, it's best to keep passages in the same tense. Spelling. Dictionaries often list alternate spellings for words. Be careful to use the same spelling throughout your writing. Also, be sure to spell names and titles accurately every time. Punctuation style. There's more than one correct way to handle commas and other punctuation. You may, for example, choose an open approach to commas, which uses just enough commas to make meaning clear, or a closed approach, which almost seems to overuse commas as a courtesy to the reader. Pick a style and use it consistently. Editorial style. In publishing, editors refer to editorial style or house style, which is not writing style, but rather issues not governed by grammar, decisions about which editors may have a choice, such as a publisher's preferences regarding capitalization, spelling out of numbers, handling of titles of various kinds of works, distinctive treatment of words, abbreviations, quotations, notes, and bibliographical references, and myriad other typographical matters. Book publishers typically use the Chicago Manual of Style to govern style decisions. Magazines and newspapers use the Associated Press style book. A couple of good supplemental style books are the Christian Writer's Manual of Style by Bob Hudson, which is great for most Christian works, and the SBL Handbook of Style, a standard for Christian scholarly writing. That's the Society of Biblical Literature, SBL. Choose a style manual and use it to impose consistency on your work. 3 pet peeves in editorial style. 3 of my pet peeves in the area of editorial style are overcapitalization, overemphasis, and overuse of scare quotes. Overcapitalization. It's not necessary to capitalize words to indicate a concept or big idea, or to capitalize generic terms or pronouns to show respect for institutions or people. The use of lots of capitalized words is distracting and can even seem old-fashioned or grandiose. Other than proper nouns, capitalize words only when confusion would otherwise result. For example, if there were more than one internet, you might capitalize the internet to differentiate it from other internets. But there's only one, so lowercase it. 2, overemphasis. Don't use italics and boldface and all caps to emphasize a word. It happens a lot. Just use italics. Some writers give their sentences visual emphasis to match the emphasis we give words in speech, but well-constructed sentences already read with the right emphasis, and italicizing every emphasized word in a paragraph gives the text a stilted effect. Use italics for emphasis only when needed to prevent misreading. And finally, overuse of scare quotes. Scare quotes are quotation marks that are used to alert readers that a term is used as in a non-standard, ironic, or other special sense. Using lots of scare quotes is like winking and nudging your way through an entire conversation. Don't apologize for using casual or figurative language by using scare quotes. Save them for when confusion is likely to result without them. Okay, well, let's return to our editing exercise to simulate your third pass through your manuscript. This time, note only problems with correctness, such as errors in spelling, punctuation, and grammar, and keep an eye out for matters of editorial style, such as capitalization and the spelling out of numbers. Note any facts that should be checked, and watch for inconsistencies in spelling, punctuation style, and editorial style. As before, don't actually edit, just note where you found a problem. And in 5 minutes, I'll highlight a few problems before we conclude.
There was that get-together at 2:30. It's now 2:30.
Oh, is there a get-together?
Yeah. That's great.
Okay. How about this? I will conclude, and yeah, you can take this home, and you'll see where I've highlighted stuff in the balloons. Here's my final paragraph. So I hope the exercise has shown you the value of polishing your work by editing it in 3 passes, giving each pass a different level of attention. When you get home, try this exercise again, this time fixing the problems you encounter, and then compare your work with the key. If it's been a while since you've last had a grammar class, consider picking up a grammar book and giving it a good review. You might also consider buying a style book. A used, older edition will work fine to guide your decisions in editorial style. If you can find another writer to trade editing services with, you may benefit from that relationship. And not least of all, reading good stylistic prose and poetry can tune your ear. All of these suggestions can help to make you a better writer, a creator of beautiful, well-made things. Thanks.